Okay, we are live. Hey everybody, welcome to the July Exchange SA Chat. We are here with John Childs and we're talking about mentorship. And oh my goodness, Twitter is already blowing up and the chat hasn't even started. This is going to be so much fun. John, thank you so much for being here. Just want to kind of introduce you to everyone. So John is the CEO of Evidence in Motion, and he is the youngest fellow of the American Physical Therapy. And I am so excited for him to be here. He's been a mentor to many and had mentors, and recently wrote a post on EIM's blog, a 3-part post on mentorship, and just sparked a lot of conversation. And so we're so excited to have you. Welcome.
Thanks, Alexis. It's good to be with you guys, and appreciate you, especially as students, taking time out of your busy evening away from studying probably to join us. It's good to be here.
Yeah, we're so excited. So I always have a Google Doc on my computer here that Brian, our director of membership, kind of mans for us. And we're going to have a couple of people behind the scenes to help because there are already 4 pages of questions for
wow. We better get going, and I'll try to talk fast.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of give a disclaimer. If we miss your question, which it is very likely tonight because there are several, just shoot us a direct message, shoot me a direct message, and we'll chat. We'll get it figured out, but we'll try to answer as many as we can, and here we go. So Jared asks, when is the best time to seek mentorship during PT school?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't think you can start seeking mentorship too early. I mean, hopefully most PT students, by the time they get into PT school, had 1 or 2 people that maybe served as some source of inspiration, that even contributed to their desire to be a therapist. So mentorship is not one of those things, and certainly if you've read some of the writing I've done on mentorship on the blog, you can appreciate that mentorship's not a program. It's not something that you sort of sign up for in year 1 of PT school and randomly get this thing called a mentor assigned to you, and then you, without any sort of reason or relationship, strike up a conversation and start getting mentored. It's much more, when it works best, it's much more natural than that. It's when you're an eager young DPT student, maybe even in your first semester, and you're really giving it that extra effort, and you invariably will catch the attention of a certain faculty member or clinician or someone who just looks at what you do and says, that's kind of a student that's got some skill and some energy. Maybe some of their work is overblown and almost over eager. But you'll attract people that will want to invest in you just in a natural sort of a way over time. So that's a long way of saying there's no time too soon to start seeking out a mentorship, and you'll do it best based on your actions.
Yeah, so kind of like be the person who in 20 years you want to be mentoring, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. You have to, you have to set yourself out from the crowd. I mean, that can sound a little self-serving, because, right, if you do that to a fault, you become that student that none of us want to be in our PT class, where we're the goody two shoes, always, raising our hand, the overeager, the constant volunteer, and you sort of become the disdain of your class because you're like the class pet. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about the sincere pursuit of knowledge and just a work ethic, a desire to learn. It's a natural thing that really good students do that attract really quality mentors. You won't have to go seeking mentors. You'll have people that are naturally investing in you, and the next thing you know, you find yourself calling them a mentor without ever really intending it to be set up in that way. It's a very natural process.
Yeah, I love that. So Amy DePelto asks, what makes a quality mentor-mentee relationship? And I think you kind of answered that in that. Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think what characterizes the best mentor-mentee relationships, well, let me first of all suggest what I think is not sort of ideal. There's this mindset that mentoring is some sort of altruistic effort where this wise sage of a mentor who's past his or her prime is now able and willing to spend time with the next generation. And they do so out of completely sort of noble and with altruistic kind of efforts. And don't mishear me. There is a sincere desire among individuals like myself and others who've had a lot of opportunity in this profession. There is some sincere altruistic desire to pour back into the next generation. That I'm not trying to dismiss that. But what I will say is that the best mentorship relationships that happen are invariably those where there's a win-win. There's a young, motivated, extremely talented potential mentee who is wanting to be a part of something bigger than him or herself and is willing to come alongside and underneath the leadership of someone else. And it ends up that person adds a lot of value to that person's life. For example, in my case, when I was completing my PhD program in Pittsburgh, I was that overeager PhD student that was always wanting to be a part of every single research project that was going on in the department. I didn't care what the topic was. I didn't care about authorship. I didn't care about recognition. I wanted to learn. And the way I knew I could learn was to get involved and be the guy that came in at 8 or 9 o'clock at night for 5 nights a week collecting data when no one else wanted to be there. And when I did that, number one, I learned because I was there by myself sometimes and equipment breaks and I've got now the stress of figuring out how to fix it. No one else is there. So I learned. Yeah. But then I also naturally set myself apart. And as you add more value to people's lives, again, that mentorship mentee relationship becomes a true win-win.
That's beautiful. So Tim Rethorn asks, any specific areas or fields to look for mentorship outside of physical therapy?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's always important to stick your head up outside the profession and realize that there's a lot of other great tools and resources completely outside of the profession. For me, that started early on in my career. I mean, I'm sort of a glutton for punishment when it comes to education. And as soon as I finished PT school, I went out and did my MBA. And so the next thing you know, I'm sort of interacting with a lot of business leaders who have a completely different profession outside of healthcare. And so I'm learning outside my field. You can't read enough. And Lord knows there's enough books and lists and podcasts. I mean, we have no excuse when it comes to information. You just have to actively seek it out and be willing to stretch yourself and get outside your comfort zone. So no doubt about it, getting sort of your knowledge set outside the profession is for sure part of the key to success.
I love that. So Josh Elam asks, what are the top 3 attributes of a great mentee?
So top 3 attributes of a great mentee, and now I'm supposed to come up with a perfect list right on the fly.
Right on the fly. Exchange essay.
Yeah, that's right. I think a good mentee has to be humble. Anyone that thinks they've arrived and knows what they're doing is not going to be willing to learn and is going to sort of shun the best mentors. So you've got to be humble and recognize that there's a gap in your knowledge that you want to fill. I think secondly, you have to be willing to then look for the experts that can help fill that void. And you have to find a way to get connected to them. And you have to be willing sometimes to make a move geography-wise or change jobs potentially. And then I think the most important part is you have to actually be willing to do something. There's sort of, if I've heard it once, I've heard it a million times, it's all about sort of who you know. And that is such an incomplete statement. I mean, and it's no better personified than in social media, where you can have these social media personalities who are well, quote unquote, known, and they've got lots of followers. but they're really not adding substantive value to their mentor's potential life. And they just think that if you just happen to rub shoulders with this person and you go to a lot of conferences, that just by knowing them and being able to go have a beer with them, you're just going to naturally, like, it's going to rub off. And if only it were that simple.
Yeah.
It's so much harder than that. You have to, yes, get in the right environment and know people, but then you have to absolutely work your brains off and show yourself time and time again that you're worthy of someone pouring themselves into you. And the importance of that goes up the higher up the ladder of mentorship that you want to go. And what I mean by that is if you really want to pursue some like fast burning, like get in with the best of the best, you're competing with a lot of folks who kind of want to be in that environment, and you've got to separate yourself, and then you have to work that much harder to sort of get attention. And I saw that for sure when I was in an environment like Pittsburgh. I mean, I was used to, being a 4.0 student, and I was always the guy that getting the best grades. And, I showed up in Pittsburgh, like, this bright-eyed PhD student, and I was a fully funded graduate student. I was funded by the Air Force. And so the department didn't have to pay for me. So I was kind of special, in my mind. And I was there to like prove like that I was, that they should be glad to have me in Pittsburgh, because I was a fully funded doctoral student, only to realize that they just did not care about me being there. And it made no difference that I was fully funded. The only thing that mattered was when I actually started to add value. And then like 6 months into my time there, they finally actually started knowing my name. And then they started to think, this guy's like, he's actually making stuff happen. And then it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy from there. You start getting more opportunities, but it took forever to break into that culture where it was so results oriented that I could walk through the department day in and day out, and no one would even know I was there or care. What mattered was delivering.
Yeah, that's so good. So Josh Huang asks, is it better to seek a mentor who aligns with your practice or to find one with a different perspective?
I think it's always a little bit of both. The best mentors are going to be those that you can work with day in and day out. You want to be in a practice setting day in and day out where ideally you're seeing your mentor on a regular basis. And I don't mean meeting them once a week for coffee for an hour of mentorship. Yes, that happens. But I mean where you show up at work every day and you have the chance to look across the room and just start to see how the mentor is acting in their real world, to be a part of meetings that they're leading, where maybe you're a spectator sitting around the room and you see difficult conversations happening and you learn how they respond in those environments. You see them in negotiations around compensation or hiring, or if it's in clinical practice, you're watching them, treat patients. And as the mentee, you start to imitate them. It's not unlike a child, right? That is with their parent enough that their habits, they start to move their hands in the same way. They start to develop an accent that looks similar. Their preferences become kind of similar. If mom likes it, the kid likes it. Same thing with mentorship. You literally start to mimic. You try to copy in many ways the habits of your mentor, and then see what's working and what's not.
Love that. So if you want a different perspective, align yourself with someone with a different perspective, right?
Yeah, well, and when it comes to seeking mentors kind of outside, you want to be very, very careful not to believe everything you think, right? So groupthink is extremely dangerous, even in the best settings where you're under world-class mentorship. You're going to have a still very limited perspective. And so you're always smart, even in those environments, to be careful not to believe everything you think. Be a skeptic but don't be such a skeptic that you come across as being, just sort of difficult to work with. You're so skeptical, but you're healthily skeptical and seeking, input from other crowds and other perspectives that may be on the other end of the spectrum.
Love that. So Josh Kronowski asks, what is your advice for a student who's interested in doing a PhD after DPT school? I know there's several students that are going kind of interested in that route, maybe immediately or maybe later. So what is your advice for that?
Yeah, I used to feel very strongly about, it's just funny how your advice changes over time. So if you're going into clinical research, if you really want to pursue a career in clinical research, I would have to encourage people to go into clinical practice for a period of years, become residency trained, really understand the clinical environment, in order that you can be relevant in your research agenda, whatever it may be. And we've had physical therapy over the last 20 years has been dominated by clinical research, and it's certainly been where the emphasis of my work has been. If I were, doing my PhD now, I would be going into health services research. Health services research is to the next 20 years of PT what clinical research was for the last 20 years. And frankly, you can go into health services research without having a sort of rich clinical background. You can go straight from your DPT into your PhD program, because health services research is a lot of big data, process of care oriented kinds of questions that frankly doesn't require the same level of kind of familiarity with the clinical environment, at least from the details of a treatment perspective. So I think it just depends on what you want to do. If you want to do basic science, for example, research, you can go straight into your PhD. But if you want to do clinical research, I still think you've got to be in clinical practice for 4 or 5 years before you would sort of branch out into your PhD.
And get that mentorship while you're there.
And get that mentorship while you're there. That's right.
Wonderful.
And if you're, and I didn't mean to interrupt, but if you're thinking, even as you go into PT school, that really what you want to do is research, which that hopefully is a minimum number of folks, right? We want to become therapists to change the world in clinical practice. But if your bent is to go straight into PhD, then by all means go to a DPT program that is in a very academic rich kind of an environment, so that you can at least get exposed to that process early on, even as a DPT student.
Love that. So I was just going to put an announcement out there to everyone who's watching. Make sure as you're talking on Twitter to use the hashtag ExchangeSA for everybody to follow along on the conversations. I know it's blowing up and going crazy, and everyone's just having a wonderful time on there. So we will continue with this wonderful discussion. So Matt Downey asks, how do you manage a mentor-mentee relationship that's long distance?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't think, first of all, I would say it's not as ideal as being in a scenario where you're showing up at work every day with, and I hesitate to almost use the word mentor, because it sort of implies that one person is the person that is sort of investing in you. And I like to think of it as a mentorship team. The best mentorship happens in teams. It's in environments where lifelong learning is part of the culture, and you better have thick skin, because to put yourself up underneath that, you're going to have to be wide open to just straight brute criticism. It's painful, especially if you're used to being sort of the feature of the, you're kind of used to being the star, and now you're really going to be relegated to not just a secondary role, but like a minion level role for potentially a long time. So my point is that mentorship happens best in teams, when you're in environments where you can really learn from a number of different people. When it's at a distance, by definition, it's going to tend to be more of a one-on-one type of relationship. It's going to be probably more limited to more strategic kinds of advice. It's going to be, those mentors are great when you need career advice. you've got a choice between two different clinical environments and you want some advice on, which one might be better than the other. Long distance mentoring, can work for those higher level 30,000 foot kinds of questions. In terms of, mechanisms, there's jillions of platforms. Obviously face-to-face is ideal. Hopefully you can meet folks at meetings and conferences and, those kinds of things where you can spend some, an hour or two over a meal, over a drink, and, really get to know folks.
Right.
But, hopefully those kinds of long distance mentors are what I would call supplementary. They're people that are in your network, but they're ideally not the people that you're leaning on day in and day out to mentor you.
Okay, I like that. I like that answer. That's great. Okay, so Ryan Madry asks, how much financially should you sacrifice for a great mentorship program, mentorship relationship at your first job?
Yeah, well, I again, there's no magic bullet right answer. But I would go so far as to say that you almost can't invest you can't invest too much. And I'll use myself as an example. I mean, I spent tens of thousands of dollars of my own money chasing every continuing education course known to mankind as a young therapist. We didn't have residency programs, fellowship programs. So our only way to create a semblance of a residency program was to package together weekend after weekend of courses and conferences, go to every meeting. And I vividly remember living below my means as a young therapist. My wife worked at the time. We lived on one salary. We saved the other one, used part of that to, she thought I was crazy. I was spending money out the wazoo, taking those of you, Alexis, you're laughing, you know what that's like. You show up at every single conference. And you question yourself early on because you see your peers taking the best paying jobs or higher paying jobs. And they're sort of driving nicer cars than you do a little earlier. They're maybe buying their first home before you do. And I remember being like 5 years into my career, sort of going, is this really worth it? Because I had poured so much into my education and learning. And then it seemed like there was this tipping point, and there's no magic answer for when this tipping point happens. But around year, 5, year 6, all of that investment starts paying off in the form of opportunities that I was getting that weren't available to a lot of other folks who had just gotten out there and sort of taken, the best job. And by the way, I want to be real clear that there's no single answer that's best in terms of whether you go out and get a high-paying job versus sacrificing going into a residency, making half of what you might make in a new job. If you go to a private school and you've got debt that's $150K plus, I don't know how you do residency, practically speaking. I mean, unless you're just, you've got family supporting you or a spouse that's working and support you. I mean, they're just practically, there's not a right, don't beat yourself up if you're just simply not in the position to make those choices, but be honest with yourself and know what's possible and what's not possible. What's impossible is finding a starting job as a therapist making $85,000 a year. And oh, by the way, you're also going to get great mentorship and do a residency. That's unrealistic. They don't go hand in hand. And so you just have to be realistic about what you can expect relative to what you're willing to invest.
Awesome. That's so good. Rush Hendricks asks, is there a point of diminishing return with mentors? Choose wisely, or the more the merrier?
Yeah, I would rather have a few mentors that I'm going really deep with than having a lot of loose kinds of connections that are sort of only half-heartedly invested in me. I would much rather have a few mentors, and I think sometimes it's analysis paralysis. I see this a lot with prospective residents, for example, who they have all these fancy Excel spreadsheets where they've got every residency listed in a row, and then they have like all the pros and cons written out and the costs and how much they're going to make at this residency versus that residency. And I think it's more simple than that. I mean, I think you get around people who are in a position where you want to be. You find that person who you really respect, you really trust. They're on a career path that you say, you know, when I'm at that point in my career, if I can be sort of where they are, I will have had that's kind of what I think I want. And then you go to them. It's real simple, I think. You go to them and you say, what should I do? And then usually in less than 5 minutes, they can say, well, you can do this, A or B. And then as the mentee, you just do that. Like it's not that hard. And so if you just simply ask people that you trust, but then you have to be willing to do what they say. And again, we can always lean on our own experiences. When I was looking at PhD programs, I didn't look at any other PhD programs. I mean, Rob Weiner was a mentor of mine. He was on faculty in my PT program when I was a student. He had gone through his PhD program in Pittsburgh, and he's like, John, it's world class. This is where the movers and shakers are. I didn't know. I knew sort of Tony. I'd sort of heard his name, but I didn't really know who Tony was. I had never heard of Julie Fritz before. She was this naive young doctoral student, overeager, had just finished. I didn't know any of those people, but I knew Rob, and Rob said, John, go to Pitt. And so I said, okay. I mean, people want, like, they want a secret recipe, like it's some formula where, it's like you got to have this secret pinky handshake thing and you got to be in the club. It's not that hard.
Yeah.
What is hard is being willing to follow that advice, because sometimes that's the hard part, because it really might mean a move in geography. It might mean delaying getting married, or maybe pushing back having kids, depending on where you are, phases of life. So getting the information isn't the hard part. The hard part is being willing to take the risk and executing.
Love that. So Robert Will asks, how can you make sure you are a good mentee? What does a mentor look for when choosing a mentee? And you kind of explain that in the beginning. Anything else to add to that? And that's for PPT and PTA students as well.
Yeah, no, it crosses over both PT and PTA. And again, I would sort of go back to what I said earlier. There's not this pool of mentors out there looking to select a mentee. I mean, I suppose there's people that would consider me their mentor. I don't consider myself a mentor in that I don't use that word. But if you asked people like, well, how did you get to where you were? I know that there's a number of people who might say I had some influence and helped them along, and, oh, you might use the word mentorship, but I didn't really select them. They selected me in the sense that and I'll use Josh Cleland as a great example, and hopefully Josh will eventually hear this. Josh, most everybody knows Josh Cleland, right? So in about 2002, probably 12, 14 years ago now, he shows up at AOMP. I'm a doctoral student, a no-name doctoral student in Pittsburgh. And he comes up to me at AOMP and says, I want to do research, and I want to be a part of what he was trying to stroke my ego. He says, I want to be a part of what you're doing. Josh didn't care at all about me, but he knew I was connected to Tony and to Julie and to some real movers and shakers. And he knew that if he could convince me, I might be able to speak on his behalf and get him plugged in to what we were doing. Well, Josh was really awkward. I mean, Josh is still, Josh wears, the guy has a hard time dressing. He wears like these miscolored t-shirts under a dress shirt, like where you can see through it. And he's got on a coat and tie, and you can see the Spider-Man, thing under. I mean, that's just Josh.
Taking finally to the whole new level.
He's finally gotten married, and it's getting better in his early 40s, but it's taken him a long time to get there. But it was really awkward, and he was kind of
trouble.
Yeah, he was kind of a pest, and I remember vividly thinking, Josh, I mean, like, this guy's annoying, and I kind of would distance myself when I would see Josh. I would sort of walk the other direction, but he kept persisting, and he would not leave me alone. And at some point, I'm like, my God, the guy, I got to throw him a bone. I mean, I literally like got him involved in a project, not because I wanted him to go away. And so I threw in this like no name project. And next thing I know, there's an IRB submission and there's like 10 patients that have been recruited.
Wow.
And it's like, man, this guy's actually doing something. And then the next thing you know, like one thing leads to another, and you're like, maybe I need to pay attention to this guy. Like, he's for real. He's awkward. He's got a lot of rough edges, but he delivers. And that's how that happens. It is simply demanding attention, hopefully appropriately. Josh would even say it was awkward. But then more than that, once you get the attention, it's doing something with it, because you have a very limited bandwidth to work with. You better deliver fast, because you're not going to get attention for long if you're not delivering.
Love that. So Yemesi El Beauty, and girl, sorry if I messed up your name again. Let's see, what makes your mentors great? What's the most valuable way that they communicate with you, John?
I think what makes my mentors great is also what makes it the most difficult. What makes my mentors great is that there's a trusted relationship where people can say to me, hopefully behind closed doors, exactly what they think, no matter how hard it is, no matter how critical it is. There's no passive aggressive sort of, it's just really critical feedback, and hopefully it's delivered decently. I'm not talking about being cruel to people. I remember, Pittsburgh, the environment there was, it was a very, Tony had created a culture there that was very healthy, but really pretty critical. I mean, I remember my first, case reports that I would submit. You had to submit to a faculty sort of panel. You couldn't just submit a paper to a journal as a doctoral student, because they didn't want crappy work going out the door, because you represent the institution. Right. And so your paper had to actually make it out of sort of an internal peer review group before you could submit. And I just remember, literally crying the first couple of times because my work was so bad. And, I'd write a 50-page case report, and I was all proud of myself because of how verbose I could be, only to realize I was like 10 times over the word limit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And those are just those lessons that where you have to be willing to be around people that are not afraid to tell you what they think. And so the best mentors are those where there's a trusted relationship, and where they can give you, critical feedback, because unless you're willing to hear that, you don't have the chance to improve.
Wonderful. So Dr. Brooks, PT, asks, what are students, residents, and newer therapists hoping to get from their mentors? So what's kind of your perception of that? I think a lot of people on Twitter can tell us more about that, but what's your perception on that?
Yeah, I'll put myself back into and I'm still a student today. I mean, that's, by the way, that's another sort of a misnomer, is that you're a mentee when you're young, and when you're old, like me, you're a mentor. And nothing further could be from the truth. I am a student every single day. I am blessed to have a number of mentors in my life that I get the privilege of working with every single day. And I still very much function in the role of a mentee. In many parts of my life, I am in a truly learning mode. And so, well, remind me of the question. I'm just, what was the question again?
Oh, I'm like soaking all of this in.
Yeah. I'm kind of going off on a tangent.
Well, I feel like I lost my place on here. I'm sorry, but I don't know what the question was either, because I'm like going all with you. So we'll just move on to the next one here. Sorry about that. Krista Green asks, what is something we can do right now to prepare us to be good mentors after we graduate?
Yeah, I think the only way you can become a good mentor eventually is to be a good mentee. You've really got to put yourself up underneath someone's leadership, learn the ropes. And then I would say, don't be afraid to invest early on into those coming behind you. I mean, this idea that you need to be a clinician for 5 years before you become a CI, I mean, I say that that's hogwash. Some of our residents that have been out of school for a year but have been through an intensive residency are some of our best clinical educators, and they become better mentors by teaching into the next crowd kind of coming up. You can't, it's been said that you don't really learn something until you can teach it. And so if you're willing to mentor others, you may be thinking of yourself as the mentor, but the reality is you're actually learning and really reinforcing a lot of those things by teaching it. So that's the other, by the way, reverse mentorship, while we're, sort of talking about this kind of topic. I mean, Alexis, you and other students that are really active, I mean, I absolutely consider many of you my mentors to help me understand what the needs of the next generation actually are. I mean, to give you an example, as we think about our own strategy on the EIM side in terms of designing what next generation sort of we think DPT education looks like, the only way we really understand that is to really sit down and listen and really know what the current DPT students are, what are they struggling with, what's working in DPT and what's not, and being willing to learn new technologies and social media, and not be that person that we see sometimes, where they're just so slow to adopt and they end up becoming irrelevant after a number of years. So it's being willing. Reverse mentorship is mentorship is not defined by age, I guess, is my point.
That's a really great point to make. And I think a lot of, with mentorship being this big buzzword, I think we're all kind of breaking it down syllable by syllable, figuring out every little aspect of it. And I think sometimes it is good to step back and to take that 30,000 foot view and just say, okay, what is it really? And it's that two-way street. I mean, it's kind of funny to hear you say that us students are mentors to the people that we look up to, but James Buenaventura was saying that on Twitter earlier, that we are mentoring him in the same way. So very, very interesting and good point. Yeah. So Brian Duke asks, sometimes clinicals accept students to recruit for open positions. Should students use internships to recruit for mentors?
Yeah, I mean, if as you're making decisions about clinical internship and education, right, you're always, or should be, thinking about the next phase. I mean, so ideally, as you're seeking clinical sites, you're not seeking a site as much as you are a person or group of people that you want to be working with, right? So one of the biggest mistakes I see students making is putting a lot of preference around geography, wanting to be in a certain part of the country because they get to ski, because they get to do whatever it is, and then they sacrifice their learning experience for being in a great climate or whatever it may be. And you only get one shot while you're in PT school to be in this sort of intensive phase. If you go into residency, maybe you extend that by a year. If you go straight on to fellowship, maybe you extend it by a year and a half or 2 years. But what we know from the data is that you're going to be practicing 10 and 15 years from now, pretty similar to what you're learning in your DPT program. And that's pretty discouraging if you think about the possibility of really mediocre clinical education. You're going to have a very difficult time sort of righting that ship because this is the only phase of your life, for the most part, where you're going to be dedicating so much of your bandwidth into your professional career. Again, it may be extended with residency, which is a great thing. It may be extended with fellowship. Maybe it's extended with a deep dive into postgraduate, a PhD program, whatever it may be. But as that sort of formal education ends, you're getting married and you're having kids and you're going to work every day, and not because you're a bad person or a bad therapist, but you're going to be suffering from the knowledge leak phenomenon, especially if you're not in a real target-rich environment with ongoing mentorship. So my point is take advantage of the opportunities early, because it's going to set up your career for a really positive trajectory, or one that puts you behind a lot of your peers, and then it's hard to catch up.
Wow, that's some intense stuff there. I love that. We have still got tons of questions coming in, so moving right along. Everyone, make sure you're still using the hashtag ExchangeSA on Twitter, and hope you're enjoying these wonderful conversations. So Kylie Fletcher is asking, how do you politely move on from a mentorship if you feel it's no longer mutually beneficial?
Yeah, again, it's not a formal process where you sort of sign this contract, it's not working like you want, and then you go to your mentor and you say, hey, I don't think I want you to be my mentor anymore. I mean, if it's very mechanical like that, it's probably not the best kind of relationship anyways. I would say a couple of things. Number one, seek to preserve the relationship. Be super careful not to burn bridges, because you never know. It's a small world, and so even if you're in a really less than optimal situation, try to exit with grace, I guess, and salvaging your reputation and not burning bridges. And again, I'll use just a real quick personal story. When I first got to Pittsburgh and I was going down the PhD path, I was originally working fully with Jay Ergang and Kelly Fitzgerald in a line of knee osteoarthritis research. And they were really young in their research careers at that time. And I got about a year or so into my PhD. I was having a great experience, but I was starting to struggle with the possibility that I wasn't going to be able to finish in 3 years, because the research agenda around knee osteoarthritis in Pittsburgh at the time just wasn't as well developed as the spine research was. It was further along in its development, and so there were more opportunities as a PhD student to plug into that line of research and finish in a reasonable amount of time. I was in the Air Force. I only had 3 years. I couldn't extend my PhD beyond that. And so that was a case where it wasn't that my mentorship relationship wasn't working. It was working. It just wasn't working on the timeline that I felt like I could reasonably get it done. And so I sort of switched in the middle and went down a heavy spine sort of line of research. And that's where a lot of the manipulation rule, kind of my involvement in that, got plugged in. Started working more closely day in and day out with Julie. But I was extremely careful not to destroy those relationships that I had built with both Jay and with Kelly. And I was very sensitive to not abandoning them, right? I mean, I was this, really eager doctoral student that was helping them and supporting them in their careers. And I felt obligated to not renege on my commitment. And so I ended up going down sort of two process. I mean, I basically did two projects. I mean, I was like, guys, I'm going to keep supporting you. I'm not abandoning you, but I got to run down this other path too, so I can finish in 2 years. And that was a rough time, because, PhD students are valuable. And here I had a track record with them. And what do you mean you're going to go work with, and of course they supported Tony and Julie. I mean, it was, they're all part of the same faculty, but now my sort of efforts were sort of being channeled elsewhere. And that was a tough transition, but they came to, I think, appreciate and respect that I didn't abandon them, that I completely honored all of my commitments. And so when that's happening, I would encourage you, if you've committed to something, keep your commitments. And if you have to break a relationship, do it with, dignity, and by all means, don't burn bridges, because it is especially at the top, it's a small world.
Yeah, for sure. Well, PT in general is just, feels like such a small world. So,
yeah.
And it sounds like another point to add to that story that I kind of took away from that is the communication was there consistently. So you having that clear communication with your mentors, with the old and the new, so to say, and just keeping that communication level there made it that much easier. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
For sure. Okay, we've got still wonderful questions, and we are quickly running out of time, but Kendra Lucas asks, what 3 questions should I ask my mentor to facilitate growth?
Again, it's a loaded question because you could take it a lot of different angles. I think you have to ask, I think you have to ask your mentor, where do they see, if they were in your shoes, where the biggest opportunities are. That I think you ask, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? How would you respond? Which of these opportunities would you take if it were you? And then, I think asking for honest feedback, again, really giving your mentor permission to be critical. And when they're a little overly nice and not critical enough, you're sort of continuing to prompt them. You sort of are not letting them off the hook, and you're seeking that out. And then again, I think probably the third thing is to ask them and understand what the key sort of differentiators were for them in their own career, and then seek to emulate that. So it's trying to find the secret sauce of what are those key decisions that you make over the course of your career that end up altering the entire trajectory of the rest of your career.
Wonderful. So Ryan Haskins asks, what resources are out there for DPT students to seek out those opportunities? Maybe it's mentorship, maybe it's just to grow, to become a better mentee.
Yeah, I think, attending meetings as a DPT student is probably one of the best ways, because you're not going to find any other setting where you have a crowd of so many key leaders in the profession, all in the same place. And so it really gives you a chance to rub elbows, be involved, whether it's locally within your own school, on committees, being involved in things like student assembly, but be plugged in and be seen and be recognized. And again, it's more than being seen in some sort of superficial, popular way, but being seen as being someone that really wants to make a difference and is willing to put in the time and energy. And that's one of the real hardest parts, I think, is that it can be years of drudgery. I mean, I think one of the biggest mistakes I see people making is they want to try to shortcut the process, and they look at someone like myself or others that have accomplished anything, and they want to try to do what took me 20 years, and they want to do it in 3 years. And they think that there's some way that you can shortcut the process. And, it's like, I don't know, it was a good 10 years before I think I was breaking through the light of day. I mean, and I was doing, grunt work, labor, anything anyone would ask of me because I wanted to learn. And you gotta, it's not about you, it's about the team, and it's about being a part of something that is going to be bigger than yourself. And by definition, if you're going to do that, that means you're going to be a really small fish in a really big pond for a long time. And we all have egos. We all kind of want the spotlight if we're honest with ourselves. And it's really hard to stay in that mode for year after year, day after day. But boy, when you're willing to do it over the long term, you accelerate way past a lot of your peers, as that sort of benefit comes to fruition over time.
Wow, I love that. There's that fine line between, we are standing on the shoulders of the ones before us, and we are moving our profession forward by doing so. But in the same breath, we can't just completely take away everything that you guys did before us and just totally start from there. I mean, we've got to put in the work and show our value and grind it out.
Yeah, no, and and your point's really well taken, and that's why, and I will say, at my stage of my career, when I look at the next generation coming behind, I will have been an utter failure unless people like you come along and accomplish things bigger than anything I've ever been able to do. And that's hard, right? Because that means that I'm hoping that you beat me one day, and that you do more than I do. But if I'm really an effective mentor, then I'm passing along a set of skills that someone else has sooner than I did, better than I did, and is able to leverage that to do better. And I'm from San Antonio, so you're going to have to bear with me. But Tim Duncan's a perfect example, right? He just retired. And Tim Duncan would be the first one to say that if the Spurs suck for the next 5 years because of Tim's retirement, then he didn't do his job as the leader of that team in bringing around talent like LaMarcus Aldridge and others who are going to go on to do things bigger and better than he did. And you talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. Tim Duncan got to do what he did because he had it modeled by David Robinson before him. And everybody's celebrating Tim. Well, the only reason we're celebrating Tim is because David Robinson before him. And so when you look at people that have achieved anything in life, you will find a trail of mentors that goes back generations. It's always about the next generation coming behind you and being able to do things better. And Tim got the benefit of winning more championships than David, but it's in no small part to that sort of seed that was planted, when he started.
Absolutely. I have no doubt that our profession is just going in an absolutely wonderful direction with being involved in the student assembly and just being around all of the students, all of the members of the APTA, the student members who are the student assembly. I mean, it's just beautiful and exciting to see where our profession is going. So on to our next question here. We've got time for a couple more. So if you've got some, send them on in. James McAfee asks, how do mentors effectively delineate soft skills? And what questions should we be asking our CIs? Kind of a two-part question. I'll ask you again if you need to. So first one, how do mentors delineate soft skills?
Yeah, I think, and I guess we have to define what we mean when we say soft skills. And I hesitate to use the word soft skills relative to hard skills because it sort of implies that soft skills are maybe something less than hard skills in terms of their importance. It's like when we talk about subjective information and objective information in the exam, right? The history is probably more valuable than the physical exam in so many areas, but one is quote unquote subjective, and therefore maybe it's not as important as these sort of special tests and objective things we do. Same thing with soft skills. So when you talk about soft skills, I think about things like empathy, caring, compassion, emotional intelligence. And I think in a mentor-mentee relationship, those skills are modeled best in real time with patients, where again, you're literally, even if it's across the room and you're with another patient, you're observing all of those sort of intangible things that really expert clinicians are doing. If you really watch master clinicians practice, you will become much less impressed over time with sort of some fancy hand skills that they have. And you'll really start to understand that what they really know how to do is develop rapport with a patient and get a patient to really buy into what they're asking them to do. They genuinely care. They understand and listen to the patient's story. They seek to know the patient's name. There's a genuine relationship. And when you have sincere empathy for someone in pain and really get to know their story, that rapport is developed, And again, it's imitating. You really learn to copy how that mentor is responding and acting, and you literally parrot it. I mean, you try to use the same questions and the same words, and you almost, I sort of think of it that a true mentee-mentor relationship when you watch the mentee behave, and you see them literally taking on facial expressions and mannerisms that you go, oh my gosh, that looks just like, then you know that like you've arrived in that relationship. You literally almost start to embody and look like the other person.
It kind of goes back to that previous question earlier. Choose wisely. Choose your mentor wisely.
Yep, no doubt about it.
Sure. So Kendra Lucas asks, what questions should I be asking potential employers about mentorship opportunities?
Yeah, and again, it depends on your, when I think about mentorship as a new grad, my mind immediately, right, wrong, or indifferent, goes to residency training. But that doesn't always mean that. There are a lot of employers, for example, that have really strong leadership development programs for new clinicians that have, onboarding kinds of programs. So, ask about, what are the sort of ongoing learning opportunities that they offer, whether it be residency or whether it be continuing education, or whether it be a leadership development track that employer might offer. But the other thing I think you have to do is be extremely careful not to expect your employer to fund all of that. And so I think where you can have the best situation is when you have a prospective therapist that's willing to sort of have skin in the game and is willing to share in some of the costs of that expense. Because when you have skin in the game, invariably you're gonna work harder, you're gonna invest more. So you want to be in an environment where it's available, but be careful not to expect necessarily your employer to foot the bill for at least all of it, anyways. Right. The more you're willing to pour in, the better opportunity you'll have.
Love that. That was a great quote to end the night on. What a wonderful exchange chat for our July chat. This has been awesome. Do you have any last parting words?
No, no last words, except I know how these things go, having contributed question after question in similar sorts of forums, never to have my question get answered. So by all means, if you've got one out there, you can always find me at ChildsJD on Twitter. And other social media, email at john@eimpt.com, and my cell phone 210-364-7410. There's always a few crazy students that are crazy enough. Everybody always questions like giving out my cell phone. Very few ever call, no matter how much I give it out. And those who do are usually the kinds of students that I want to get to know. And that never hurts. So in any event, feel free to reach out if you got questions. I'm happy to stay in touch with folks. You don't learn mentorship in an hour-long Google Hangout, but hopefully you do have a few sort of things that have kind of piqued your interest and maybe give you something to chew on. As you sort of start your careers, best of luck to all of you students. I get super excited about our future when I hang out with young people, especially young PT students. We're in very, very good hands. We have a lot of challenges and maybe some headwinds ahead in the short run, but the long-term prospects for what we do is some of the best in the business. And we've got a great generation of young people coming behind us.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. As always, I'll give out a few announcements here. So our July Pulse issue just went out on the blog, and you can find that all over social media. We've got great stories out this month on #ChoosePT and what we students can do about it. I'm sure several of you have already read the blog on RC11, what we can do about it as well. And our next exchange chat is August 17th at 9 p.m. Eastern, and we are talking about clinical experience and how we students, PT and PTA students, can make the best of it. And that's going to be with PT students on Twitter, and we're also going to try to get as many of our CIs on Twitter as possible so we can have a really great interaction on Twitter. And we're talking with Steph Wyrock and other colleagues, Carrie from the APTA education section. So it's going to be a great chat next month, and looking forward to seeing you all there. Be sure to read the Pulse and share it with your friends. Thanks everybody for being here. We had a wonderful time, and we'll see you next time. Catch you on Twitter.